Traditions and Encounters by McGraw. Part 2, Chapter 6, Legalism. Ultimately, neither Confucian activism nor Taoist retreat was able to solve the problems of the period of the warring states. Order returned to China only after the emergence of a third school of thought, that of legalist, which promoted a practical and ruthlessly efficient approach to statecraft. Unlike Confucians, the legalists did not concern themselves with ethics, morality, or propriety. Unlike Taoists, the legalists cared nothing about the place of human beings in nature. Instead, they devoted their attention exclusively to the state, which they sought to strengthen and expand at all costs. Shang Yang and Han Fizi. Legalist doctrine emerged from the insights of men who were active in Chinese political affairs during the late 4th century BCE. Most notable of them was Shang Yang, circa 390 to 338 BCE, who served as chief minister to the Duke of Qin State in western China. His policies survive in a work titled The Book of Lord Shang. Though a clever and efficient administrator, Shang Yang was despised because of his power and ruthlessness. Thus, when his patron died, Shang's enemies at court executed him, mutilated his body, and annihilated his family. Another legalist theory, Han Fizi, circa 280 to 233 BCE, also fell afoul of ambitious men at the Qin court. During his life, Han Fizi synthesized legalist ideas in a collection of powerful and well-argued essays on statecraft. However, his enemies forced him to commit suicide by taking poison. Thus, the legalist state itself consumed the two foremost exponents of legalist doctrine. Shang Yang, Han Fizi, and other legalists reasoned that the foundations of a state's strength were agriculture and armed forces. Since both lines of work directly advanced the interest of the state, legalists sought to channel as many individuals as possible into cultivation or military service. Meanwhile, they discouraged others from pursuing what they believed were less useful careers: merchants, entrepreneurs, scholars, educators, philosophers, poets, or artists. The legalist expected to harness subjects' energy by means of clear and strict laws, hence the name legalist. Their faith in laws distinguished the legalist clearly from the Confucians, who relied on education and example to induce individuals to behave appropriately. The legalists believed that this was not enough to persuade individuals to serve the needs of the state. They imposed a strict legal regimen that clearly outlined expectations and provided severe punishment for violators. They believed that if people feared to commit small crimes, they would hesitate all the more before committing great crimes. Thus, legalists imposed harsh penalties for even minor infractions. Individuals could suffer amputation of their heads or feet, for example, for disposing of trash in the street. The legalists also established the principle of collective responsibility before the law, whereby all members of a family or a community were liable to be punished along with the actual violator. The legalist principles of government did not win them much popularity, yet legalist doctrine lent itself readily to practical application, and legalist principles of government quickly produced remarkable results for rulers who adopted them. In fact, legalist methods put an end to the period of the warring states and brought about the unification of China. During the period of the warring states, Rulers of several regional states adopted elements of the legalist program. Legalist doctrines met the most enthusiastic response in the state of Qin, in western China, where Shang Yang and Han Fizi oversaw the implementation of legalist policies. The Qin state soon dominated its neighbors and imposed centralized imperial rule throughout China. Qin rule survived for only a few years, but the succeeding Han dynasty followed the Qin example by governing China through a centralized imperial administration. The Qin dynasty. The kingdom of Qin. During the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, the Qin state underwent a remarkable round of economic, political, and military development. Shang Yang encouraged peasant cultivators to migrate to the sparsely populated state by granting them private plots. The policy dramatically boosted agriculture production while it simultaneously weakened the economic position of the hereditary aristocratic classes. As a result, Qin rulers found fewer obstacles to establish centralized bureaucratic rule throughout their state. Meanwhile, they devoted their newfound wealth to the organization of a powerful army, equipped with the most effective iron weapons available. During the 3rd century BCE, Qin rulers attacked one state after another, absorbing each new conquest into their centralized structure, until finally they had brought China for the first time under the sway of a single state. The first emperor. In 221 BCE, Qin Shangdi, the king of Qin, reigned 221 to 210 BCE, proclaimed himself the first emperor and decreed that his descendants would reign for thousands of generations. In fact, the dynasty lasted only 14 years, dissolving in 207 BCE. Because of civil insurrections, yet Qin dynasty had a significance out of proportion to its short life. Because like the Achaemenid Empire in Persia, the Qin dynasty established a tradition of centralized imperial rule that later rulers sought to emulate. Like his ancestors in the first kingdom of Qin, the first emperor of China ignored the nobility and ruled his empire through a centralized bureaucracy. He governed from his capital at Xinjiang, near the modern day of Xi'an. The remainder of China he divided into administrative provinces and districts, and he entrusted the implementation of his policies to officers of the central government who served at his pleasure. He disarmed regional military forces, and he built roads to facilitate communications and the movement of armies. He also drafted laborers by the hundreds of thousands to build a massive defensive barrier that was precursor to the Great Wall of China. Resistance to Qin policies. It is likely that many Chinese welcomed the political stability introduced by the Qin dynasty, but it did not win universal acceptance. Confucians, Taoists, and others launched a vigorous campaign of criticism in an effort to reassert his authority. Qin Shangyandi ordered execution for those who criticized his regime. In the year following his decree, for example, he said to have sentenced some 460 scholars residing in the capital to be buried alive for the criticism of his regime. Qin Shangyandi also demanded that all books of philosophy, ethics, history, and literature be burned. Although he spared some works on medicine, fortune-telling, and agriculture on the grounds that they had some utilitarian value, many classical literary or philosophical works were lost. Qin centralization. The first emperor launched several initiatives that enhanced the unity of China. In keeping with his policy of centralization, he standardized laws, currency weights, and measures of the various regions of China. Previously, regional states had organized their own legal and economic systems, which often hampered commerce and communications across state boundaries. Uniform coinage and legal standards encouraged the integration of China's various regions into society more tightly knit than ever before. The roads and bridges that Qin Shi Huangdi built throughout his realm, like those built in other classical societies, also encouraged economic integration because they facilitated inter-regional commerce. Standardized script, perhaps even more important than his legal and economic policies, was the first emperor's standardization of Chinese script. Before the Qin dynasty, regional Chinese scripts had developed along different lines and had become mutually unrecognizable. In hopes of ensuring better understanding and uniform application of his policies, Qin Shi Huangdi mandated the use of a common script throughout his empire. The regions of China continue to use different spoken languages as they do today, but they wrote those languages with a common script, just as if Europeans spoke English, French, German, and other languages, but wrote them all down in Latin. In China, speakers of different languages use the same written symbols, which enables them to communicate in writing across linguistic boundaries. In spite of his ruthlessness, Qin Shi Huangdi ranks as one of the most important figures in Chinese history. The first emperor established a precedent for centralized imperial rule, which remained the norm in China until the early 20th century. He also pointed China in the direction of political and cultural unity, and with some periods of interruption, China has remained politically and culturally unified to the present day. Tomb of the first emperor. Qin Shi Huangdi died in 210 BCE. His final resting place was a lavish tomb constructed by some 700,000 drafted laborers and as a permanent monument to the first emperor. Rare and expensive grave goods accompanied the emperor in burial, along with sacrificed slaves, concubines, and many of the craftsmen who designed and built the tomb. Qin Shi Huangdi was laid to rest in an elaborate underground palace lined with bronze and protected by traps and crossbows rigged to fire at intruders. Buried in the vicinity of the tomb itself was an entire army of magnificently detailed life-size pottery figures to guard the emperor in death. The terracotta army of King Shi Huangdi protected his tomb, but it could not save his successors or his empire. The first empire had conscripted millions of laborers from all parts of China to work on massive public works projects. Although these projects increased productivity and promoted integration of China's various regions, they also generated tremendous ill will among drafted laborers. Revolts began in the year of King Shi Huangdi's death, and in 207 BCE, waves of rebels overwhelmed the Qin court, slaughtering the government officials and burning state buildings. The Qin dynasty quickly dissolved in chaos. The early Han dynasty, Liu Bang. The bloody end of the Qin dynasty might well have ended the experiment with the centralized imperial rule in China. However, centralized rule returned almost immediately, largely because a determined commander named Liu Bang. Judging from the historian Sima Qian's account, Liu Bang was not a colorful or charismatic figure, but he was a persistent man and a methodical planner. He surrounded himself with brilliant advisors and enjoyed the unwavering loyalty of his troops. By 206 BCE, he had restored order throughout China and established himself at the head of a new dynasty. Liu Bang called the new dynasty, the Han. In honor of his native land, the Han dynasty turned out to be one of the longest and most influential in all of Chinese history. It lasted for more than 400 years, from 206 BCE to 220 BCE. Although for a brief period from period 9 to 23 CE, a usurper temporarily displaced Han rule. Thus, historians conventionally divide the dynasty into the early Han, 206 BCE to 9 CE, and the later Han, 25 to 220 CE. The Han dynasty consolidated the tradition of centralized imperial rule that the Qin dynasty had pioneered. During the early Han emperors ruled, cultural capital, ruled from China, Chang'an, a cosmopolitan city near modern Xi'an, that became the cultural capital of China. During the later Han, the emperors moved their capital east to Luoyang, also a cosmopolitan city and second in importance only to Chang and throughout much of Chinese history. Early Han policies. During the early days of the Han dynasty, Liu Bang attempted to follow a middle path between the decentralized political alliances of the Shao dynasty and the tightly centralized state of the Qin to reap the advantages and avoid the excesses of both. On the one hand, he allotted large land holdings to members of the imperial family in the expectation that they would provide a reliable network of support for his rule. On the other hand, he divided the empire into administrative districts governed by officials who served at the emperor's pleasure. Liu Bang learned quickly that reliance on his family did not guarantee support for the emperor. In 200 BCE, an army of nomadic Xiongnu warriors besieged Liu Bang and almost captured him. He managed to escape, but without receiving the support he had expected from his family members. From that point forward, Liu Bang and his successors followed a policy of centralization. They reclaimed lands from family members, absorbed the land, those lands into the imperial domain, and entrusted political responsibilities to an administrative bureaucracy. Thus, despite a brief flirtation with the decentralized government, the Han dynasty left as its principal political legacy a tradition of centralized imperial rule. The martial emperor Han Wudi. Much of the reason for Han dynasty's success was the long reign of the dynasty's greatest and most energetic emperor, Han Wudi, the martial emperor, who occupied the throne for 54 years from 141 to 87 BCE. Han Wudi ruled his empire with vision and vigor. He pursued two policies in particular: administrative centralization and imperial expansion. Han centralization. Domestically, Han Wudi worked strenuously to increase the authority and prestige of the central government. He built an enormous bureaucracy to administer his empire, and he relied on legalist principles of government. He also continued the Qin policy of building roads and canals to facilitate trade and communication between China's regions to finance the vast machinery of his government. He levied taxes on agriculture, trade, and craft industries, and he established imperial monopolies on the production of essential goods such as iron and salt. In building such an enormous government structure, Han Wudi faced a serious problem of recruitment. He needed thousands of reliable, intelligent, educated individuals to run his bureaucracy, but there was no institutionalized education system in China that could provide a continuous supply of such people. The Confucian education system. Han Wudi addressed that problem in 124 BCE by establishing an imperial institute of higher learning that prepared young men for government service. Personally, the martial emperor cared little for learning. In that respect, he resembled all the other early Han emperors. Liu Bang once emptied his bladder in the distinctive cap worn by Confucian scholars in order to demonstrate his contempt for academic pursuits. Yet, Han Wudi recognized that the success of his efforts at the bureaucratic centralization would depend on a core of educated office holders. The Imperial Institute of Higher Learning took Confucianism, the only Chinese cultural tradition developed enough to provide rigorous intellectual discipline as the basis for its curriculum. Ironically, then, although he partially relied on legalist principles of government, Han Wudi ensured the long-term survival of the Confucian tradition by establishing it as the official imperial ideology. Han imperial expansion, while he moved aggressively to centralize power and authority at home, Han Wudi pursued an equally vigorous foreign policy of imperial expansion. He invaded northern Vietnam and Korea, subjected them to the Han rule, and brought them into the orbit of Chinese society. He ruled both lands through a Chinese-style government, and Confucian values followed the Han armies into the new colonies. Over the course of the centuries, the educational systems of both northern Vietnam and Korea drew their inspiration almost entirely from Confucianism. The Zhongyu, the greatest foreign challenge that Han Wudi faced, came from the Zhongyu, a nomadic people from the steppes of Central Asia. Like most of other nomadic peoples of Central Asia, Zhongyu were superb horsemen. Although their weaponry was not as sophisticated as that of the Chinese, their mobility offered the Zhongyu a distinct advantage when they could not satisfy their needs through peaceful trade. They mounted sudden raids into villages or trading areas where they commandeered supplies and then rapidly departed. Because they had no cities or settled places to defend, the Zhongyu could quickly disperse when confronted by a superior force. During the reign of the Madu, their most successful leader of Zhongyu ruled a vast federation of nomadic peoples that stretched from the Aral Sea to the Yellow Sea. Madu brought strict military discipline to the Zhongyu. According to Sima Qian, Madu once instructed his forces to shoot their arrows at whatever target he himself selected. He aimed in succession at his favorite horse, one of his wives, and his favorite father's best horse, and he summarily executed those who failed to discharge their arrows. When his forces reliably followed his orders, Madu targeted his father, who immediately fell under a hail of arrows, leaving Madu as the Xingju chief. With its highly disciplined army, the Zhongyu Empire was a source of concern to the Han emperors during the early days of the dynasty. They attempted to pacify the Zhongyu by paying them tribute, providing them with food and finished goods in hopes that they would refrain from mounting raids in China, or by arranging marriages between the ruling houses of the two peoples in hopes of establishing peaceful diplomatic relations. Neither method succeeded for long. Han expansion in Central Asia. Ultimately, Han Mudi decided to go on the offensive against the Xiongnu, invaded Central Asia with vast armies, and brought much of the Xiongnu Empire under Chinese military control. He pacified a long Central Asian corridor extending almost to Bactria, modern Afghanistan, which served as the lifeline of a trade network that linked much of the Eurasian landmass. He even planted colonies of Chinese cultivators in the oasis communities of Central Asia. As a result of those efforts, the Xiongnu Empire soon fell into disarray. For the moment, the Han state enjoyed uncontested hegemony in both Asia and Central Asia. Before long, however, economic and social problems within China brought serious problems for the Han dynasty itself. From economic prosperity to social disorder. Already during the Xia, Shang, and Zhao dynasties, a productive agricultural economy supported the emergence of complex society in China. High agricultural productivity continued during the Qin and Han dynasties and supported the development of craft industries such as the forging of iron tools and the weaving of silk textiles. During the Han dynasty, however, China experienced a serious social and economic problems as the land became concentrated in the hands of a small, wealthy elite class. Social tensions generated banditry, rebellion, and even the temporary disposition of the Han state itself. Although Han rulers regained the throne, they presided over a much weakened realm. By the early 3rd century CE, social and political problems brought the Han dynasty to an end. Productivity and prosperity during the early Han. Patriarchal social order. The structure of the Chinese society during the Qin and Han dynasties was similar to that of the Zhao era. Patriarchal households averaged 5 inhabitants, although several generations of aristocratic families sometimes lived together in large compounds. During the Han dynasty, moralists sought to enhance the authority of patriarchal family heads by emphasizing the importance of the filial piety and women's subordinate to their menfolk. The anonymous Confucian classic of the filial piety, composed probably in the early Han dynasty, taught that children should obey and honor their parents as well as other superiors and political authorities. Ben Zhao, woman scholar, an equally influential treatise, was Lessons for Women by Ban Zhao, 45 to 120 CE. Perhaps the most famous women scholar in Chinese history, Ben Zhao was born into a prominent literary and political family. Her father was a famous scholar and educator. She had 2 brothers who were twins. One was a powerful general, and the other followed in the footsteps of Sima Qian as the foremost historian of the later Han dynasty. Ben Zhao herself enjoyed an advanced education and argued the lessons for women that education should be available to all children, girls as well as boys. Yet Ben Zhao agreed with the classic of the filial piety and Confucian morality in general that virtues most appropriate for women were humility, obedience, subservience, and devotion to their fathers, husbands, and sons. From time to time of its composition around 100 CE to the early 20th century, Lessons for Women was one of the most popular and most widely read statements on the role of women in Chinese society. Iron metallurgy. During the Han Dynasty, the iron industry entered a period of rapid growth. Han artisans experimented with the production techniques and learned. I'm sorry. I will go back to that page, so if you want to watch it, read it. Craft fine utensils for both domestic and military uses. Iron pots, stoves, knives, needles, axes, hammers, saws, and other tools become standard fixtures in households that could not have afforded more expensive bronze utensils. The ready availability of iron also had important military implications. Craftsmen designed suits of iron armor to protect soldiers against arrows and blows, which helps to explain the success of Chinese armies against the Xiongnu and other nomadic peoples. Here's connecting sources, if you wish to pause. Silk textiles. Textile production, particularly sericulture, the manufacture of silk became an especially important industry. The origins of the sericulture date to the 4th millennium BCE, but only in Han times did sericulture expand from its original home in the Yellow River Valley to most parts of China. Although silkworms inhabited much of Eurasia, Chinese silk was especially fine because of advanced sericulture techniques. Chinese producers bred their silkworms, fed them on finely chopped mulberry leaves, and carefully unraveled their cocoons so as to obtain long fibers of raw silk that they were wove into light, strong, lustrous fabrics. In other lands, producers relied on wild silkworms that ate a variety of leaves and chewed throughout their cocoons, leaving only short fibers that yielded lower quality fabrics. Chinese silk became a prized commodity in India, Persia, Mesopotamia, and even the distant Roman Empire. Commerce in silk and other products led to the establishment of an intricate network of trade routes known collectively as the Silk Roads, discussed in Chapter 9. Paper. While expanding the iron and silk industries, Han craftsmen also invented paper. In earlier times, Chinese scribes had written mostly on bamboo strips and silk fabrics, but about 100 CE, Chinese craftsmen began to fashion hemp, bark, and textile fibers into sheets of paper, although wealthy elites continued to read books written on silk rolls. Paper soon became the preferred medium for most writing. Population growth. High agriculture productivity supported rapid demographic growth and general prosperity during the early part of the Han Dynasty. Historians estimate that about 220 BCE, just after the founding of the Qin Dynasty, the Chinese population was 20 million. By the year 9 CE, at the end of the early Han Dynasty, it had tripled to 60 million. Meanwhile, taxes claimed only a small portion of production, yet state granaries bulged so much that their contents sometimes spoiled before they could be consumed. Economic and social difficulties. In spite of general prosperity, China began to experience economic and social difficulties. In the early Han period, the military adventures and the Central Asian policy of Han Wudi caused severe economic strain to finance his ventures. Han Wudi raised taxes and confiscated land and personal property from wealthy individuals, sometimes on the pretext that they had violated imperial laws. These measures discouraged investment in manufacturing and trading enterprises, which in turn had dampening effects on the larger economy. Social tensions, distinctions between rich and poor hardened during the course of the Han Dynasty. Wealthy individuals wore fine silk garments and ate rich foods, whereas the poor classes made do with rough hemp clothing and a diet of mostly grain. By the 1st century BCE, social and economic differences had generated serious tensions, and peasants in hard-pressed regions began to organize rebellions in hopes of gaining a larger share of Han society's resources. Land distribution. A particularly difficult problem concerned the distribution of land. Economic problems forced many small landowners to sell their property under unfavorable conditions or even to forfeit in exchange for cancellation of their debts. In extreme cases, individuals had to sell themselves and their families into slavery to satisfy their creditors. Owners of large estates not only increased the size of their holdings by absorbing the property of their less fortunate neighbors, but also increased the efficiency of their operations by employing cheap labor. By the end of the 1st century BCE, land had accumulated in the hands of a relatively small number of individuals who owned vast estates, while ever-increasing numbers of peasant cultivators led difficult lives with few prospects for improvement. Landless peasants became restive, and Chinese society faced growing problems of banditry and sporadic rebellion. The reign of the Ming tensions came to a head during the early 1st century CE, when a powerful, respected Han minister named Wang Ming undertook a thorough going program or reform in 6 CE. A 2-year-old boy inherited the Han imperial throne. Because the boy was unable to govern, Wang Ming served as his regent. Many officials regarded Wang as more capable than members of the Han family and urged him to claim the imperial honor himself. In 9 CE, he did just that, announcing that the mandate of heaven had passed from the Han to his family. He seized the throne. Wang Ming then introduced a series of wide-ranging reforms that have prompted some historians to refer to him as the socialist emperor. The most important reforms concerned landed property. Wang Ming limited the amount of land that a family could hold and ordered officials to break up large estates, redistribute them, and provide landless individuals with property to cultivate. Despite his good intentions, the socialist emperor attempted to impose his policy without adequate preparation and communication. The result was confusion. Landlords resisted a policy that threatened their holdings, and even peasants found its application inconsistent and unsatisfactory. After several years of chaos, in 23 CE, a coalition of disgruntled landlords and desperate peasants ended both his dynasty and his life. The later Han Dynasty. Within 2 years, a recovered Han Dynasty returned to power, but it ruled over a weakened realm. Nevertheless, the early years of the later Han emperors ruled vigorously in the manner of the Liu Bang and Han Wudi. They regained control of the centralized administration and reorganized the state bureaucracy. They also maintained the Chinese presence in Central Asia and continued to keep Zhongyu in submission and exercised firm control over the Silk Roads. However, the later Han emperors did not seriously address the problem of land distribution that had helped to bring down the early Han Dynasty. The wealthy classes still lived in a relatively luxury while peasants worked under difficult conditions. The empire continued to suffer the effects of banditry and rebellions organized by desperate peasants with few opportunities to improve their lot. Collapse of the Han Dynasty. In addition to the later Han emperors, were unable to prevent the development of factions at court that paralyzed the central government. Factions of imperial family members, Confucian scholar bureaucrats, and court eunuchs sought to increase their influence, protect their own interests, and destroy their rivals. On several occasions, relations between the various factions became so strained that they made war against one another. In 189 CE, for example, a faction led by an imperial relative descended on the Han palace and slaughtered more than 2,000 eunuchs in an effort to destroy them as a political force. In that respect, the attack succeeded from the unmeasured violence of the operation. However, it is clear that the later Han Dynasty had reached a point of internal weakness from which it could not easily recover. Indeed, early in the next century, the central government disintegrated, and for almost 4 centuries, China remained divided into several large regional kingdoms. This is the end of chapter 6, part 2.